Hi, everyone. Welcome to Afikra. We're really excited to have you all online, and I'm really excited to host today's presentation. I got lucky because I think this one is going to be amazing. My name is Maha. I have been involved with Afikra for, a couple of years now, and I used to help run the DC chapter, and now that we are in a virtual world, I am just generally helping out. But I'm really excited today to have Mysa presenting on if there were Arab passengers on the Titanic, a topic I've never thought about, and I think that's one of the greatest Afikra topics that you can have. Mysa is going to talk to us about if there was Arab passengers on the Titanic. We're really excited. So if everyone can just ensure that their mics are muted, I'm going to kick it off to Mysa to start her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to pretend like everyone had loads of really important things to do and everyone's not stuck at home staring out the windows in lockdown in various countries. So thank you for being here. My name is Mysa. I've been on the Afikra team for a while. I'm the regional ambassador for Europe, and I also do story time on Instagram with the amazing Farah, who is in here today as well. So if anyone wants to talk about those things, speak to us at the end, and we can tell you all about that. Before I get started today, I just want to say one thing. When I first presented this, I think it was in October 2019, it was a really, really short version of this. And I presented alongside a member of our London team at the time, Norhan Nassar. And a couple of months after that event, she passed away really suddenly. And we were going to have an event in March 2020 in which we were going to kind of acknowledge that and celebrate her and celebrate everything that she did for Afikra, and especially because she was really instrumental in in setting up the London team. And so I haven't presented since then, and so I just kind of wanted to say something about her and celebrate her, and we love her, we miss her, and this one is for Norhan. So thank you guys for being here. I will get started. So, were there Arab passengers on the Titanic? Let's see. So just to start, my presenter's promise. I'm not an expert, but I promise that I tried to learn as much as I could to satisfy my curiosity about this topic. My field is art, so I'm definitely not an expert. Someone here might know more than me about this topic, so please do correct me. I'm sure there are definitely, I know there are people in here that definitely know more about certain topics that I'm going to talk about today. So please feel free to correct me, ask questions, put it all in the chat, and then hopefully we'll have some time to get to it at the end. I'm not trying to persuade you of my agenda or convince you to take any kind of action. My only hope is that my presentation might cultivate some kind of curiosity for yourself. So, what led me to this? When the film Titanic came out in 1997, me, like the rest of the world, I became completely obsessed with the film. And it wasn't just the Leonardo hype and all of that, like everyone else was going through. It was the story, it was just the whole thing. It was just, I became a complete Titanic fangirl. And then when I rewatched it as an adult, I noticed something which led me to do some research. Did you guys hear that?
I think we heard it. Mysa, why don't you explain what they said in the clip just to confirm if I heard it correctly?
So basically, oh yeah, wait, hold on. I will get back to this. 1 second. So yes, anyway, in the clip, which some of you heard, I hope, or some of you might remember from the film, you can see by this really confused, panicked family trying to translate the signs and speaking like a really Hollywood version of Arabic, saying yalla yalla. We get a slight hint that maybe there were some Arabs on board. So obviously this made me a little bit confused, but also intrigued me and made me want to do some research. So just to let you know the outline for today. So firstly, we're going to look at the Titanic itself, what happened, the event. Then we're going to look at were there any Arab passengers? Spoiler alert, yes, there was. That's why we're here today. Otherwise, there would be no presentation. Then we're gonna go off on a bit of a tangent to contextualize where these people were traveling to and why they were traveling there. So we're gonna look at the Arab American communities in the early 20th century in the US. And then we're going to look at the reporting of the sinking in the newspapers, and then the passengers and some of their stories. So what happened? The unsinkable luxury ship, the Titanic, sailed on its maiden voyage from Southampton on the 10th of April, 1912, picking up more passengers in Ireland and France along the way. The ship was headed for New York, and at 11:40 on the 14th of April, the ship hit an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This caused the ship to flood, start to sink, and then eventually it split in two and sank completely at 2:20 a.m. on the 15th of April. Of the estimated 2,224 passengers and crew on board, more than 1,500 people died, making the sinking at the time the deadliest of any single ship. So, were there Arab passengers on the Titanic? Yes. The numbers are disputed, but it's thought that out of about 1,317 passengers, with the rest being crew, there was about like a minimum of 130 and could have been up to about 165 passengers of Arab origin on the ship. Different newspapers reported different numbers, and so the estimates really varied. All Arabs on the ship were in third class, apart from 3 to 4 people, one of whom was a member of the crew. So where did they come from? Almost all of them are generally referred to as Syrians, but that was a really broad term at the time. Greater Syria was a term used for present-day Syria, Lebanon, parts of Palestine, parts of Jordan, and that was all until the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. And even me kind of using the term Arab in this context is kind of problematic in the sense that we don't necessarily know if they identified as Arabs per se. Syria, as it was then and as it still is now, encompassed so many ethnicities, faiths, identities, and all we know is that they were Arabic speaking. They came from what was regarded as an Arab country. And so I'll be using the terms Arab and Syrian interchangeably, although I'm very aware that that's quite generalizing. Why were they making the journey? 1912 was during the peak of Syrian immigration to the US, which was roughly between 1880 to 1920. Apparently between 1910 and 1914 alone, 1/4 of the population of what is now Lebanon emigrated, many of them going to North and South America. Back home, there were food shortages, political and religious tensions, epidemics, various conflicts. And so people would leave looking for work and for a new life, usually following family or friends who had settled elsewhere. Many of them struggled to understand what was happening when the ship was flooding and sinking. A lot of the third-class passengers who couldn't speak English remained below the deck, just wandering around trying to figure out what was happening. The crew gave them no instructions and everything was lost in translation. Generally, third-class passengers were treated like trash anyway, but the struggle to understand and be understood made it so much worse. They were told by officers that everything was fine, to return back to bed. Many of the partitions to third class were closed, and generally there was an effort to keep them back so that first and second class passengers could be the priority for lifeboats. Because women and children were prioritized, many men from third class were actually shot on the deck when they were trying to get onto the boats, even if the boat wasn't completely full. Arab survivors saw a lot of their men being shot and killed in front of everyone. And out of all of the Arab passengers, only about 38 people survived, and only 4 of them were men. So when those passengers were rescued from lifeboats, they were taken to New York by another ship called the Carpathia. Third-class passenger names didn't even appear on the initial list of survivors in all the American newspapers. And when they did, Arab names were totally misspelled, really weirdly anglicized, and so no one knew who these people were. Also, to complicate it more, these people were technically Ottoman subjects, and many of the women were identified by their husbands' names. A lot of the kids had their fathers' names, and often when Syrians would say they were Syrian, they were also misidentified as Assyrian, leading to even more confusion. So it was just chaos. Sorry. Oh God. Sorry, guys. 1 second. But anyway, let's take a look into the America that these people were traveling to. A lot of people think that the Arab community in the US so early in the 20th century would be pretty non-existent, or maybe just really, really tiny, but actually it was huge and it was booming. Little Syria in New York was the center of the city's Middle Eastern community for decades. It was based in and around Washington Street on the west side of Lower Manhattan, and it became a thriving community and the prime destination for Arab immigrants in the 1880s. German and Irish immigrants had already lived there before. They had arrived earlier, and they had established import and export businesses close to the waterfront. And then when the Arabs arrived, that's exactly what they did too. They came all the way from Ottoman-controlled Greater Syria, and between 1880 and 1924, around 100,000 Arabic-speaking people moved to the US. The area became like a big cultural hub, and by the early 1900s, Syrian Americans had created more than 300 businesses in New York alone and developed loads of community organizations, such as the Syrian American Club of New York. Businesses were booming in this area. The Arab immigrant work ethic was crazy. There were Syrian textile factories on Washington Street, one of which apparently employed 200 Syrians in 1895. Women were employed by Syrian cigarette manufacturers. A Turkish smoking parlor was set up by an Iraqi entrepreneur in 1895, and that sparked a trend. And according to the Washington Street Historical Society, there were almost 500 smoking parlors in operation in New York by 1900. Arab grocery stores and restaurants were all over the area too, and doctors, surgeries, dentists, so many more. And this is a film that I found on YouTube, which shows some clips from the early 1900s, I think around the 1920s, 1930s of that area. And it will finish in just 1 second. Local newspapers were fascinated by them. They were fascinated by their clothes, their traditions. There are multiple reports about the community, sometimes little pieces about them fighting with Greek immigrants or other immigrants or whatever, but generally just a lot of American intrigue. They loved writing about Syrian food, especially. This one piece from 1905 from a Syrian sweet shop, although the photos are separate, they're from the Library of Congress from around that time. But I love this report. There's this one Arab khala on the left being interviewed, and she's telling the reporter that everything comes from the Middle East, even potatoes. And then another person claiming that there's no good coffee in America and how her husband has to go back home to bring coffee to the US. And so it was really interesting capturing their personalities at the time. Another reporter wrote about what they call the Syrian colony in New York, with the line, "Immigrants from the East who make good citizens." Again, fascinated by their community, their food, their hospitality, their bishop who smokes cigarettes, and of course, their shisha. What's great though is that although they came to the US for a new life and essentially to become Americans, they didn't lose themselves in the process. They held on to their traditions, their culture, and they stood really, really firm in their opinions. One amazing part from this specific article was when one Syrian was asked about American Christian missionaries going to the Middle East to spread the Christian faith, and responded with this: "Why should you send missionaries to us who live in the land where Jesus walked and who were Christians before America was dreamed of?" I love that quote so much. So the Arab community generally lived in cramped tenement blocks, but those who started to earn more and more money began to leave the area and move to Brooklyn, creating what they called Little Syria Part 2. Around Brooklyn Heights and Atlantic Avenue, that's where that was based. The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel was built in 1940, so most of the remaining residents in the original Little Syria were evicted and displaced. And then when the World Trade Center was built around the 1960s, anyone that was left basically had to move on. Boston was also a huge Syrian hub as well, but not quite as big as New York. Arabs started to settle there around 1890, and the full community was something like less than 1/3 of the size of New York's. But also Boston itself was far smaller than New York. Boston Syrians tended to be employed rather than self-employed, and they worked in large factories usually. By 1908, New York had hundreds of Syrian-owned businesses, whereas Boston had about 38. A friend of mine and the husband of one of my best friends actually made a really cool video about Boston's Little Syria, which is in the links at the end, so you can watch it later. So shout out to Omar for that, thank you. Okay, so I found a book in the New York Public Library website at 2 a.m. one night. It blew my mind. I didn't sleep. I just went crazy. It gives us an amazing, amazing insight into the number of Arabs who had emigrated to the US at the time and how established they were. There was a man called Dr. Najib Abdu, and he created this commercial directory of Arabic-speaking people, first in 1908 and then in 1910. This is the 1910 issue, and there may have been later ones as well. So it mainly focused on the US, but he also ventured into Canada, South America, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Europe, and even reported on some Arab immigrants in Japan. It's incredible. It goes through all the states, it lists the number of Syrians, again, used as a broad term because I'm sure a lot of these people aren't just Syrian in the modern sense. He wrote a little paragraph on each place and what the situation for the community was like there. But look at how many there were. By 1910, there were 23,000 in New York, 12,000 in Massachusetts, 8,400 in Ohio, 2,100 in Michigan. But what amazed me was how many had gone to the South and to the West Coast by this point as well. There were 6,000 in Louisiana, 4,200 in Texas, 1,500 in California. And a lot of the Arabs who had gone to California had headed there to get involved in the Californian wine scene. Dr. Abdu listed all of the Arab-owned companies, what they did, ran advertisements for them, gave information on currency, immigration, how to do business, everything an immigrant or a business owner would need at that time. And it really shows us the presence, not just in terms of numbers, but just shows us how established they were. But Arab Americans in this period around the Titanic, they weren't just limited to business, industry, restaurants. They were also huge, huge producers of culture. Arab-owned music labels popped up. People weren't just listening to Arabic music created back home. They were also listening to local productions as well. A Syrian-American musician named Alexander Ma'louf kind of went with a slightly old school Orientalist music trend with things that would appeal to Americans as well as Arabs, with titles like Harim Dances and Call of the Sphinx and things like that. In 1912, he also responded to a presidential call for the new national anthem with a song called America Ya Hilwa, which then became For the America. It didn't get chosen, but apparently New York public schools took it on as a patriotic song for assemblies. A part of American history, which I often forget about, is Prohibition era. And I never thought until recently about the Arab experience under Prohibition. The green record in the middle of the screen, it's made by a man called Milhem El-Hawi, and he produced this. It's kind of like a spoken word track in 1920, lamenting the loss of alcohol, and he called it Goodbye Whiskey. And I wish I could play it for you guys, but it's a SoundCloud link and I couldn't embed it, but it's in the links at the end so you can go crazy when we're done here. Art also really flourished in this period. There were amateur artists, professionals, art dealers, critics, galleries popping up, and it was a really buzzing, creative Arab American space. Khalil Gibran, a pioneer of Arab American art, already had his first major exhibition in Boston by 1904. And portrait artist Esad Ghosn left Syria in 1891 to study oil painting in Rome before arriving in the US and then opening a studio in Brooklyn, painting portraits of like really important figures and also advertising his services in local newspapers. And that's one of his adverts there. Nicholas Maqsood, a painter from Zahle in present-day Lebanon, who arrived in New York in 1899, became the treasurer of the Brooklyn Society of Artists and the president of the Brooklyn Society of Miniature Painters. So he was really well established beyond the Arab American community as well. Asa Hilou, whose name I know is spelled really weirdly on the slide, but that's how I found it online, so I didn't want to change it because he may have spelled it like that. He lived in Pennsylvania, and then he began studying art in New York and creating art from the 1920s. Local museums and galleries had a pretty insular agenda at the time. It wasn't always easy for them. Museums purposefully excluded immigrants often. And so Arabs figured it out for themselves, asked businesses like clothes stores, hotels to exhibit their work. The Lebanon restaurant in this photo, which was on Washington Street, regularly exhibited Arab artists in the windows and on the walls. Literature was a really huge deal. Arab American poets at the time were doing some really radical stylistic experiments and basically created their own movement. El Fanoun was the first literary and artistic magazine for the Arab community. It was launched in 1913 in New York by Nasib Arida. In 1916, the Pen League, or El Rabita El Khalamiyya, became the first Arab American literary society in the US, formed in New York with important figures like Amin Irhani and Khalil Gibran and so many other important people. Arab American writers found space for their work too, with, Arab women writers. Figures like Afifa Karam, she wrote about women's education, work. She wrote well-known novels around themes of social and political liberation of women. Newspapers and journals were so important to the community at this time. They gave voices to immigrant lives, helped them understand the new world around them, highlighted any racist attacks they were subjected to, and brought them news from back home and across the region. They advertised absolutely everything as well, and it kind of provided the community with something that bound them together. Kokab Amrika was the first Arabic newspaper in North America in 1892, and within a few years, there was about 6 Arabic newspapers, including El Huda, El Kawn, and Mirat al Gharb. The first Arabic linotype machine was patented in New York by newspaper publisher Salom Karzel in 1910, which meant that there was an explosion of publications. Detroit began printing Al-Ittihad. Oklahoma began printing a newspaper called the Syrian Light. Minneapolis had Al-Ummah. Houston and Texas published a paper called the Syrian Spotlight. By 1930, there were about 140,000 Arab Americans, and they had 81 publications between them, the equivalent of one newspaper for every 1,800 immigrants. The wider US in 1930 had one publication for every 50,000 Americans. So the difference is huge. So in 1912, this huge, eclectic, and multifaceted community were deeply, deeply affected by the sinking of the Titanic. The journey of Arab immigrants to the US was part of their own story, and they were always ready to welcome more of their countrymen and women to their new home. So it hit them really, really hard, and newspapers were the main form of communication with their community when this tragedy happened. So this is from Mirat al-Gharb, just 2 days after the sinking. This was the main newspaper source I could get access to through the amazing Khair Allah archive. But Al Huda also reported on this a lot, but I'm not in New York, unfortunately, to go through the public library's archive, but one day I will go, and I will go crazy. Al Huda's reports reminded readers that the Syrians on board were emigrating for a better life, but had become prisoners of fate, and how what happened wasn't just a catastrophe, but a disaster for the whole Arab American community. Mirat al-Gharb, as you can see, published a long article entitled Tragedy of the Seas, dedicating 2 or 3 pages just to the story of the Titanic. They published details of what happened, the layout of the ship, the captains, their names, the most prominent British and American passengers, and where the ship sank as well. They wanted to inform everyone who opened their newspaper about this huge event. Ships had sunk before, but this one was just such a big deal. They then moved on to talking specifically about the Syrian passengers, what happened to them, and began trying to identify them. Here on the right, for those who can read Arabic, it says Isma al-Suriyin fil Bakhra Titanic, names of the Syrians on the Titanic. The Arabic newspapers also published queries from readers requesting information about specific passengers. And these publications were kind of like just one big communal message board for the Arab community. It was all they had at the time, and people were relying on them to find out if their family or their friends were dead or alive. In true Arab mourning style, poetry featured, of course. In Mirat al-Gharb on April 22nd, a Lebanese poet named Ilyas Atallah, who was later a member of the Pen League, he wrote a heartbreaking poem dedicated to the passengers and mourning the tragedy. Also, news spread across the Arab world, of course, to family and friends and communities back in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, but it hit people really hard even further. When I told my mum about this presentation, she casually was like, oh yeah, your great grandfather wrote a poem about the Titanic in 1912, as you do. And so, so she sent it to me. And so on the right, it's a poem by my great grandfather, Muhammad Rada al-Shabibi. And it was published in August of that year in a journal called Lughat al-Arab. And he was a big writer and poet, so it's not surprising, but I was just so surprised that the impact had been felt all the way in 1912 Baghdad. And I would translate the poems for you guys, but although I did an Arabic degree, that is completely beyond my capabilities all these years later. So we'll move on. By the 22nd, the papers also started listing further confirmed names from the community of those who died, listing them by their place of origin. When the Carpathia docked in New York with the survivors, there was a 7-member delegation representing the community ready to meet Syrian survivors. They took them to 3 New York hospitals, and then other Syrian clubs organized to visit those hospitals and speak to the Syrian passengers who were admitted. They took their names, their hometowns, their family details, and they also identified any of the people who they knew who had died on the Titanic. These clubs then called the newspapers and started listing names of the dead. So as you can see on the screen, there are victims from Kafar-Mishki in the Bekaa Valley, which was a tiny town that lost 13 people altogether. Tibnin in South Lebanon, Zgharta, Betroun, Hadin, Beirut. And at the end it says, this is a list of the drowned Syrians that we were able to identify from the surviving passengers in the St. Vincent Hospital in New York. In the villages back home, countless families were affected by the loss of someone. The news spread from town to town, and in Zlata, there were reports of church bells ringing for the dead. The village of Tahom now had 3 young widows and 10 children under the age of 15 without a father. Villages had funeral services, they held prayers, and they mourned their dead for weeks. Back in New York, supporting the survivors, who weren't only in mourning, but also in shock, injured, and penniless, it became a community effort. Everyone let go of any animosity between different groups, faiths, sects, and united for this cause. They were ready to donate food, clothing, provide shelter, or just money, whatever they could. The United Syrian Society, based in Brooklyn, published call-outs for support from the community, like the advert on the right from the 19th of April, which said, "To all Syrians in New York, from the United Syrian Society, due to the recent events concerning the Titanic disaster and there being a number of our Syrian countrymen among the passengers and among those who survived, the Syrian Unity Club has taken it upon itself to care for those who survived the sinking. Last night, they were brought in aboard the ship that reached port and will be reaching us. A committee has been appointed to receive them and to ease their comfort." And then it lists names of those responsible. And those adverts were repeated again and again until they had enough to support the people who survived. Standard American newspapers in English also reported on the Syrian passengers, talking about the loss of life, statements from passengers, and a few reports on survivor Silana Eskender, who's pictured on the bottom left, because she was really young and she lost her husband. So they interviewed her. They also advertised church services for the Syrian community. The Syrian Roman Catholic Church had a service for the Syrians who died on the 21st of April, and the Syrian Orthodox Cathedral in Brooklyn had one on the 14th of May, where members of one of the Syrian clubs delivered eulogies and prayers for the dead. And after that, the congregation all walked through the streets together wearing black ribbons and armbands. So the passengers. We'll look at just a few to get an idea of who they were, their stories, and what happened to them. But don't worry, we're not talking about any of these guys, but yeah, don't worry, all of these guys survived. So, Nicola Nasrallah was born in 1883 in Zahle, present-day Lebanon, and like several of his siblings, he had emigrated to the USA, arriving sometime around 1908. They had settled in San Francisco and at some point moved to Cleveland. Nasrallah was a sweet maker and a businessman and often went by the name Nicholas Nasser in the US. He returned to Zahle briefly to find a bride, of course, and that's when he met Adal Nasrallah, who was then 17 years old, and she later went by the name Adele. They spent some time in Paris before boarding the Titanic in France as second-class passengers, and they were the only Arab passengers in second class, and they had only been married a few weeks by this point. When the ship began to sink, Nicola escorted Adal to a lifeboat, but wasn't allowed to join her. They bid farewell, and he died on the ship. Reports say that after he accepted his own fate, he spent the rest of his time saving dozens of kids by making sure they all got into boats. His body was recovered, and he was brought to New York, and he's now buried in a cemetery in Queens. In the chaos and the confusion and the lack of awareness of Arabic, names were really badly transliterated, as I said before, and especially because they were transmitted first by Morse code. Nasrallah's name was miscommunicated first as Nicholas E. Rasher, and then N.E. Coles Rasher, and then he was mistaken for multimillionaire John Jacob Astor, who also drowned on the Titanic before being correctly identified days later. Adal arrived in New York on the Carpathia, and she was met by relatives who had already emigrated there, eventually traveling to Cleveland. She probably didn't know it at the time of the sinking, but she was pregnant. She gave birth in December 1912, but their baby only lived a few hours, unfortunately. She did get remarried 4 years later, though, to an immigrant from Betrun, and they raised a family in Texas, and she passed away in 1970. El Emir Faris Shihab was born in Beirut around 1886 to a pretty affluent family, and he was about 28 or 29 when he was on the Titanic. He was married to a lady named Hind, and they had no kids. So apparently he was a very gifted musician, and he was on his way to New York to pursue a music career. He boarded the Titanic as a third-class passenger after traveling from Beirut to France. And fluent in English, it's thought that he was one of the few Arabic-speaking people on the ship who could explain the situation to other Arabs. He sadly died in the sinking. His body was never recovered, and his widow and his mother were compensated from the Titanic Relief Fund. Fun fact, his large family home is apparently now the Brazilian embassy in Beirut. So if anyone happens to go there or walk past it, there should be a plaque on the wall with his name on it, referring to the Titanic. So if anyone sees this, please take a photo, because I've been searching online and I haven't been able to find it. Shanina Abi Saab was born in Tahom, near Betroun, in present-day Lebanon in 1874. She was married at the age of 15 and had 5 kids. She came from a poor background and emigrated to Ohio in 1906 without her family, hoping to make enough money to buy land back home. Her husband died suddenly of an asthma attack, and she moved all her kids to be with her in the US. Her son, Thomas, who is in the top right, he became really sick in the US. Doctors advised him to return back to Lebanon so that the mountain air might help him. In 1910, he deteriorated, and Shanina traveled back home to see him, but didn't make it back in time. She had lost her husband and her son by the age of 38. After staying in Lebanon for about a year to sort out family paperwork and earn more money for her ticket back to the US, she traveled via Beirut to France, where she boarded the Titanic with a female relative, Ben Noura, and several male cousins. So this is Shanina and Ben Noura. Ben Noura was asleep when the boat hit the iceberg. Apparently her cousins alerted her, but they couldn't figure out what was going on, so she went back to sleep. A short while later, she woke up and found water beginning to enter her cabin. She and her cousins went to the communal third-class area, but this is where she lost a couple of them, but found Shanina. The women got into lifeboats, dressed only in nightgowns, for 6 hours. Shanina later said that some passengers actually froze to death in the lifeboats. The sailors of their boats apparently stopped rowing after about half a mile, laid down their oars, and just watched the ship sink. Shanina and Ben Noura realized there and then that they had just watched their cousins die with the Titanic. When they arrived in New York, they were cared for by the Hebrew Sheltering Arms Society, and this is where this photo of both of them was taken. They later traveled to Ohio. Shanina moved to Pennsylvania, worked odd jobs, raised her family, until eventually one of her sons opened up a successful ice cream cone factory, which is apparently still open now. She passed away in 1947. After leaving New York for Ohio, Ben Noura moved to Canada to be with one of her brothers, and that's where she married a fellow Lebanese immigrant. They settled in Detroit, had a bunch of kids, and she never returned back to Lebanon or saw her parents ever again. And she died in 1970 at the age of 75. All of the men with Shanina and Ben Noura, their cousins, were leaving Lebanon during a really difficult economic period to look for work abroad. Hanat Tanus Mawad, who was 34, had already emigrated in 1897 and was working in Ohio. In 1911, he returned to Lebanon to visit his wife and his son. And his son was about 15, 16 at the time. His name was Tanus. And his father, seeing the bad situation in Lebanon, decided to bring his son back with him to the US, thinking that he could finish his studies there and hopefully join Ohio State University. When the iceberg hit, the men woke up Ben Noura, but somewhere in the chaos, Hana became separated from his son and went down a staircase looking for him. His son emerged from another staircase. Ben Noura told him that his father had gone to look for him, so he followed him down the stairs. That was the last time both of them were seen. Tanus Tahir, another cousin who was 28 at the time, hoped to work at the steel mills in Ohio after the journey on the Titanic. He was also lost in the chaos and he was never seen again. Jerjis Yusuf Ebisab, who was 45 and was also looking for work in Ohio steel mills, he was actually the subject of a post by the Live Love Beirut account just last week on Instagram, in which his descendants explained how he had left his wife and 6 kids back in Lebanon to look for work in America. He had helped both of the women get up to the deck. Shanina offered to disguise him in women's clothing to get him onto a boat, but he declined, saying, "I'd rather die with my countrymen. I'm no different from anyone else." He apparently handed Shanina a lock of his hair and asked her to deliver it to his wife back home, with his last words to his cousin being, "Tell her I love her." Wearing a life vest, he took his chances. He jumped into the water, and he didn't drown, but instead he died from hypothermia. His body was found and later buried in Canada, where many victims were buried. Hamid Hasseb was 27, married, and was born in Cairo, Egypt. He's not only the only Egyptian on board, but the only Arab in first class. So it's an interesting story. Hamid owned a farm in Egypt, but he was also really well educated and could speak French, English, and German. He worked with Thomas Cook and Son at a famous hotel called Shepherd's in Cairo as a translator, guide, and interpreter. It was probably through his work that he met Henry and Myra Harper, also first-class passengers on the Titanic. They had asked him to join them on the trip, reportedly after he had hosted them in Egypt. He was apparently a really enigmatic, good-looking man who barely spoke to anyone on the ship. Lots of beautiful women tried to talk to him during the journey, describing him as mysterious. And apparently everyone in first class was asking about him, and he just didn't care. When the ship hit the iceberg, Hamid was apparently wandering around and happened to hear the commotion. He ran to get his two friends, and they went up to the deck, and he had to carry Henry and Myra on his shoulders and throw them into the lifeboat. Then he jumped in. I think there's a scene in the film, for anyone who's seen the film, where there are two lifeboats, one being lowered on top of the other because the other boat couldn't move from the ropes. He was apparently the person who cut the ropes, enabling the boat to move away. And so it made the crew members kind of pay attention to what was going on. He survived, sent a postcard to his brother in Cairo on April 18th, 3 days after the sinking, saying he was fine. According to his grandchildren, he barely spoke of the event, especially beyond his own family. He died sometime around 1965. What was really interesting and also quite frustrating reading about Hamid was that on a lot of records, he's classed as a servant, probably because seeing an Arab man on the records in first class made everyone assume servant. But in reality, he was a professional, educated guy who may have been working for his friends, or maybe was just accompanying them, but it's really unlikely he was a servant. Fatima Mohammed Muslimani was born in Tibnin in southern Lebanon in 1890. She traveled on the Titanic with her two cousins, and she was planning to reunite with her siblings who had already emigrated to the US, and she did survive the sinking. There's more to her story, but I'll let you guys watch a brief clip from a video that was made about her instead of listening to me talking again and again. You hear?
They wanted to come to America because they wanted to have a better life. She left Beirut to go to Belfast. And then from there, they were going to board the Titanic to come to America. She did talk a lot about the ship. She said it was gorgeous. It was like a castle. She's never seen anything like that in her life. And she had her two cousins on the ship that traveled with her from Lebanon. She was asleep, and then she heard a big, big knock, huge. It awakened her, and then she heard another one. There were two. She ran out to see what was going on, and of course everybody knew that the ship hit the iceberg. Everybody was going crazy, not knowing what to do. Everybody was screaming and yelling, and it was so much fear. People were jumping off the boat. They wanted to force her on the lifeboat. She got into the boat, and then she saw something very tragic. One of the cousins tried to get into the lifeboat, and he didn't make it. The other cousin was also trying, and they shot him. So the one went overboard, and the other one got shot. And this is what she saw. She got into the lifeboat, and when they were in that lifeboat, all they heard was screaming and people just in chaos. And then as time passed, a little time passed, the ship started to sink. And it went down, and it was so dark that she said if she were to put her finger up, you couldn't see it. It was just plain dark, and people are screaming.
Okay, so I didn't want to end on a completely depressing note, so I left this little theory till the end. You guys might remember this scene from the film, which I will play, but I will put the volume down. There we go. Okay. So yeah, they thought maybe it could have been based on a spontaneous party held by the Arab passengers, but assumed to be Irish from vague sources because there were a lot of Irish passengers on the ship. There were a lot of Irish passengers, but the film and other stories would lead you to believe that there was basically only Irish people in third class. In reality, there were a lot of others, including Scandinavians, a few Turks who were actually Armenian, a few people from China, other Europeans, and the number of Arab passengers is actually pretty much equal to the Irish. I actually looked into the numbers because I'm a loser, but like, although there were a lot of Irish crew members on top of this, so the Irish, like the general number of Irish people on the ship itself, there was a lot, but in terms of passengers, it's equal. So this is a huge number to not have any kind of representation when it comes to modern discourse around the film and the history and all of that. So apparently a Lebanese family, including an engaged couple who were due to be married in the US, started a party alongside other Arab passengers. The dancing and the drums, just as hectic and sometimes similar to traditional Irish music, it was actually the debka and the drums of other instruments of the Arab passengers, which it's confirmed they did bring with them. But of course, this is just a theory. So anyway, overall, this story isn't just about the Titanic itself and how these people have been written out of history, but it's also an important chapter in the history of immigration and the movement of Arab communities around the world. And obviously has so many echoes with what's been happening over the last decade. People who had very little, hoping to find a better life elsewhere, but unfortunately just never arriving at their destination. Anyway, I'm going to end with some Celine Dion with Arabic subtitles saying, "Every night in my dreams, I see you, I feel you," because there's no better way to end. So thank you, guys. And these are my sources, by the way. So if anyone wants anything, they're all here. I can send them to anyone. Just let me know. There's so many amazing things. The article by Leila Saloum Ilyas was so helpful. The Turath online exhibition for Arab American history is incredible. So there's so much here and some amazing Twitter accounts to follow that are really relevant. And let me know if you need anything.
Mysa, amazing job. Let's clap it up for Mysa.
Glad you enjoyed it. I knew I would go right up until the end of time. Oh my God.
Mysa, I think we have time for 2 questions.
Go for it.
Is that okay? So Nessim, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi. Yes, thank you very much for that talk. Very, very interesting subject. Yeah, so my question, you might have mentioned this earlier, but when they were shooting the Arab passengers, was it specifically because they were Arab, or was it because they're third-class passengers? Was it a general protocol?
It was general protocol. I mean, I think that all of the crew members were very badly trained for this situation. I mean, they never thought the ship would sink in the first place. They literally considered it unsinkable. And so I don't think they were trained for the situation where people needed to go onto lifeboats, because they didn't even have enough lifeboats for half of the ship. And so I think the instinct was to shoot people. And I don't think it was just purely because they were Arab. I think it was because they were third class, but the Arab proportion of third class was just quite big. So it did end up killing a lot of them.
All right.
Thank
and the
you.
last question is from Mo S. Mo?
Hi, thanks, Mysa. I was just wondering whether or not any of the places that were established by the Syrian community in New York exist today. So the Syrian American Club and the Lebanon restaurant.
I don't think so. There might be people in here that know more, who are actually New Yorkers or people who've studied it. But I think, to be honest, the majority of these places are completely gone now. And I think you can even do tours of like the Syrian area, of like Little Syria in New York, and they show you what's left, but there isn't much left. But if anyone knows anything else, please let us know.
Yeah, so actually, afikra presenter Todd Rice is the president of the Washington Washington Street Historical Society.
Amazing. It was one of my best resources for this as well.
Yeah, so I highly recommend people checking out his afikra presentation, which is in our library, as well as a lot of the stuff he has online. Which brings me to the fact that this presentation will also be on our library and will go up on our new podcast launching very soon that is exclusively focused on our community presentations. Mysa, this was amazing. So
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Clap it up. And Maha, thank you so much for hosting. Thank you everybody for joining. This presentation is a perfect example of our community presentations. What afikra is all about is getting folks like Mysa to roll up their sleeves, follow their curiosity, tug on those threads of questions, and not just leave them hanging. Maha, you exemplify the afikra spirit totally. So this was fantastic. This was amazing. I put a little link in the chat to give us feedback. Please give us feedback in there. If you're interested in us reaching out to you, you can leave your email. And if you're interested in supporting afikra and keeping all of this space open and all of our work going and growing, I will also put a link for you to become a monthly contributor into the chat. Please consider contributing to afikra and keeping our work going. And if you want to contribute, we have a workshop tomorrow. So you can start working on your own presentation. There are many people in the chat right now who are past presenters. Maha, anything to add?
I'm just currently trying to not wipe my tears. That was beautiful and saddening, but exciting. And I don't know. I think this was going to become our first Africa presentation to be turned into a feature documentary. So let's get started on that.
I'm glad in one sense that I made you cry. It meant that I'm successful in a way.
Thank you for telling the history and stories of so many people's that don't get told. And I think that is another great example of what afikra is all about. And thank you everyone for joining us. We have so many people online today. This was amazing. Yeah, and to follow us on Instagram and yeah, thank you again.
Can I say one other thing that I love about afikra? I love that past presenters and past conversation guests show up to other people's events, and this is a community for like everyone. It's not only that people show up and present and then disappear and never come back, but this is a group of people who speak and listen and contribute, and it's just so nice. So many friendly faces who care. It's really good. All right, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Go be friendly nerds wherever you are.